A Biblical Approach to Evidences for God, Jesus, and the Bible, Part 5. The Number of Confirming Events. The strength of the evidence depends not just on the number of eyewitnesses, but also on the number of confirming events. For example, if one person claims a man robbed a bank, the evidence is relatively weak. But the evidence is much more conclusive if dozens of witnesses claim to have seen the same man rob banks on numerous occasions in different places. John 20:30 and 31 say, Jesus did so many signs that not all were recorded, but enough have been recorded to convince the honest person to believe. John 21:24 and 25. John wrote his testimony and affirmed it to be true, but Jesus did so many other things that the world could not contain the books that could be written. Acts 1:3. The Bible provides many infallible proofs. Our study of these proofs will include 6 different major lines of evidence with many specific examples in each category. This will include many evidences for creation, many examples of fulfilled prophecy, many examples of miracles done by Jesus and other inspired men, and many events in which Jesus appeared to people to prove he was alive again after his death. Ability and opportunity of the witness to observe what they report. The more distant the witnesses are from the events they record, the less convincing their evidence becomes. There's little value in hearsay evidence passed from person to person, or in legendary claims recorded generations after the alleged events occurred. Most convincing is first-hand eyewitness testimony in which people testify about events they personally saw and experienced. Nearly as important are historical statements recorded by people who personally interviewed the first-hand eyewitnesses. Notice just a few of the passages showing that Bible writers were first-hand eyewitnesses of the events they wrote about, or else they carefully recorded accounts they heard or read from those who were eyewitnesses. Statements from Luke. Luke wrote a history of the life of Christ and a history of the early church in the book of Acts. He didn't claim to be a personal eyewitness of Jesus' life, but he served as an historian to record events that were witnessed by the apostles and others. He himself was, however, an eyewitness of many events in the early church. Note his use of the word we. Note that Luke did not write legends handed down for generations. Rather, he wrote what he had been told him by eyewitnesses, so we could know that these things are certain, not myth or fable. As an historian, his reputation is well established. Statements about the apostles. The apostles followed Jesus personally, traveling all over Palestine with him for a period of over 3 years. They personally observed his miracles and saw him alive again after his death. They repeatedly claimed that their statements were based on personal eyewitness testimony, and that in fact God chose them specifically for that purpose. Jesus presented himself to the apostles, so they saw and spoke with him for a period of 40 days following his death. In this way, he demonstrated himself to be raised from the dead by many infallible proofs. Acts 1:8. Jesus told the apostles that they would be his witnesses throughout the earth. Acts 1:21 and 22. To be an apostle, one had to be an eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection. Acts 2:32. Peter stated that he and the other apostles were witnesses that God had raised Jesus. They saw him die, and they saw him alive again. This was preached not hundreds of years later, but just 50 days after the events occurred. Pentecost was only 50 days after the Passover. Acts 10:39 through 41. Peter and the other apostles were witnesses of all things Jesus did. The people killed him, but God raised him up on the third day and showed him openly to witnesses. The witnesses ate and drank with him after he arose from the dead. Acts 9:22 and 26. Luke spent much of his time traveling with Paul on his preaching trips. As a result, he often witnessed miracles done by Paul's hand. He also often heard Paul's testimony regarding Jesus' appearance to him on the road to Damascus. Note that other men were present who could verify details of that event. Statements from John. John 20:30 and 31. John recorded Jesus' miracles in writing so we could believe and have life in his name. The miracles were done in the very presence of the disciples, so John personally witnessed them. John 21:24. John wrote his personal testimony and testified that it was true. 1 John 1:1 through 3. He bore witness about what he and others heard and saw with their eyes and handled with their hands. Statements from Peter. 2 Peter 1:16 through 18. Peter testified that rather than following fables about Jesus, the apostles were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Specifically, he testified regarding the transfiguration that they had heard the voice that spoke on the mountain saying, "This was the Son of God." Statements from Paul. Acts 9:22. Luke records that Paul went about proving that this Jesus is the Christ. 1 Corinthians 15:1 through 8. Paul declared the gospel he had preached, including the resurrection of Jesus and appearances. Paul lists various appearances, including the one to him. Paul's testimony is also that of an eyewitness. He names other eyewitnesses and claims that most were still alive at the time he wrote. 1 Corinthians was one of the first books Paul wrote, just 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death. Paul says the other witnesses were still alive and could be examined. Paul acknowledged that if Christ was not raised, Paul and others were false witnesses, because they testified that he was raised. These and other Bible writers claim to write what they personally witnessed or what they personally heard from personal eyewitnesses. Please notice the emphasis on this kind of testimony as we study specific lines of evidence. We'll comment regarding this from time to time. End of Part 5.